Okay, so I'll begin with thank you to Guido and the Minerva Center, Michal, and everybody here for having me. And special thanks for entrusting me giving the final presentation of this great and fruitful workshop. It is challenging in, I think, both ways. First, it's closer to dinner, and then it's challenging because it's the last presentation of after all this great presentation that we had. So have to meet this high standard that we all put. So undoubtedly the future of IHL and terror researchers is in good hands. It is personally exciting and challenging for me because it's the first time I'm presenting my recently submitted PhD thesis. So I hope I'll do it well. It's like an elevator speech for 350 pages I wrote. And so it's kind of challenging. And so let's just go into it. Again, what is common between war and law? So the first thing that comes into someone's lawyer's head would be Cicero's famous cited saying that inter arma silent leges, or the more accurate saying is silent enim leges inter arma. But you also are familiar, I'm sure, with the more modern rejection or total rejection of this saying that like Chief Justice Barak in the targeted killing case, but it's not only him, scholars, and when you look back, it goes even for Professor Martens and it goes even to Grotius. It's not the rejection go way back for this thing. So I'm going to risk suggesting a more or somehow slightly nuanced or different approach to this this issue. Maybe a bit more delusion. I think that neither the original saying nor the complete rejection of it accurately describe the relationship between war and law. It is true, of course, that law regulates today the conduct of wars. No, yes, the law does not is not silent anymore during war. But even if it's not silent, if you must carefully listen to what law says, and more importantly, what law refrains from saying. Because and most importantly, is to understand why law refrains from saying some things. It's important to me that my point is that both what is regulated by law and what is not regulated by it are part of a complex legal web constituting of strings, but also with holes in between. For sometimes law refrainment from regulating an issue does not necessarily play a solely negative role. Both what is regulated and what is not regulated by law are products of a process, so it's overwhelmed by conflicted interests, constant redistribution of powers, and compromise that shape the face of law and constantly reshape it. Thus, it's law silence on one issue that enables law to develop on other important issues. And the reason for that is that what's common to war and law, they are both of political nature. And this is the story of military necessity my work is dealing with. So how things happen in law, I'll give you an example to think about. I'll talk about later of a Swiss cheese known for both wolves and aroma, great aroma in it, and I'll explain it later. So coming back from early dinner, and with the cheese on it, Today there's a lot of writing about the way that war is changing, or warfare is changing, and sometimes say even war. Both military theory and legal writing dealing with this, the applicability of IHL with the changing phases of war, is a vast literature on it. And indeed, although there is still some academic controversy, it seems that things are changing. Whether it's a new era of war, or as Mary Kaldor and others believe, or it's not enough to call it a new era of the new wars, or just a change in the warfare, the way we conduct war, it's something that goes beyond my work. But changes have occurred. This table gives some examples for that. It's not the real issue. While it's not the whole, it doesn't pretend to say that's the whole changes of many of them. In classical war, we refer to states, and today we are seeing a growing involvement in the NSAs. The battlefield has come from the physical sphere of military clashes into other dimensions, both physically, but like other dimensions like cyber, public and international support. Lawfare has become a method of achieving your objects. Methods of war have changed again from conventional warfare, something guerrilla warfare that we always had, to terror, urban warfare, blurring identity with combatants. And we all spoke about it this workshop, but there's a very big change in the time dimension. Okay, there's no from somehow something that was determined. Generally speaking, okay, I'm generalizing things here to intermediate. So war has become asymmetric, sometimes transnational asymmetrical war, and some call it hybrid war. Okay. A good example for a definition for hybrid war, it's a definition given by McCohen. They're saying that hybrid wars are a full spectrum of wars with both physical and conceptual dimensions. The former a struggle against an armed enemy, and the latter a wider struggle for control in support of the combat zone's indigenous population. It's Americans like Iraq and Afghanistan, they're a good example for that. The support of home fronts and intervening nations, and the support of the international community. Things are much more complex. So, having said that, there's another thing that has to be said, is that it goes to the changing notion of victory. As the phase of war changed, so did military thought and military doctrine. They developed and progressed in the 19th century Clausewitzian way of thinking, which I'll go back to, and to something that is more complex today. This military thought is trying to deal with the question how to achieve victory. And generally speaking, if the Clausewitzian way of thinking spoke about annihilation, first of all, annihilation of the fighting capabilities of the enemy. Of course, it spoke about others, will to fight and other issues. Today, the story is much more complex. It does not deal only with this physical dimension, but with others. Okay, we've seen emergence of, for example, EBO, effect-based operations, with supporters, it has supporters and opposers. The doctrine calls to achieve campaign by applying effects, not by annihilating the fighting capabilities by himself. And sometimes it's like Professor Rutter has just previously mentioned, the question is not, the way to win is not to implement a lot of force, but refrain from implementing force in some situations. It's the American Army counterinsurgency manual even says that sometimes the more force is used, the less effective it is. one may achieve the conclusive victory in the battlefield and still lose the war in the other important fronts. As we spoke about the time dimension, we see that some cycles of war do not even achieve to submit the complete submission of the enemy. Okay, they not achieve. They're trying to achieve that. The real violent circles that Israel is having with Gaza are a good example for that. It seems that Israel seeks to postpone the eruption of another circle of violence, and the Hamas also has some limited goals at every time. Israel trying to achieve deterrence. How do you measure deterrence legally? As the war has changed, so does the notion of victory. And in much aspect, it's become much more political. And this is also something that writers are aware of. There are two quotes I give here. It's gazing, the asymmetry between belligerents increases, the distinction between political and military objective and necessities become more and more blurred. And proponents of the new war theory, I didn't go into it, but they obviously say that war is just politics today. There's nothing else than politics. So this brings me to consider the apolitical nature of IHL. It's like Brian quote here, Pictet saying that the IHL only chance of success lies in being carried on as far as possible outside the sphere of politics. So IHL is keeping away as far as possible from politics. It's a very, some consider it as the basic basic idea in IHL. It's the basic principle of IHL, and it comes to be it's discussed also in the context of the separation between jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Oh, I have a mistake here in my slide. It's considered sometimes as a basic principle of IHL, and indeed there are compelling reasons to keep the jus in bello separated from the jus ad bellum as an apolitical framework. IHL has to serve a mutual basis for all sides to the conflict, irrelevant of the question who's right and who's wrong. It's one of the problems we've already talked about it in this workshop, to identify the aggressor. No one will say, okay, I'm the aggressor. There is the incentive to obey law. If I'm the aggressor, okay, let's say I'm the aggressor. There's no, and law works against me. So why should I obey it? Okay, there's no reason to do that. There are policy reasons and, of course, humanitarian reasons for that, saying that basically it's not the fault of the civilians that their government is the aggressor, and the laws try to achieve it just to protect those who are not part of that circle. So on the one hand, we have a very political increase in political aspects of war, and the other hand, IHL is pulling away as far as possible from that, and trying to stay as much as apolitical. And this comes, of course, in my eyes, to brings me to my dilemma. Okay, if von Clausewitz, famous saying that war is merely an act of policy, it's not merely an act of policy, but a true political instrument, a continuation of a political intercourse carried out by other means. So how can these two live together? If war is it's a means end, it's the means end issue. So how can you just shut your eyes and not or reject or totally reject the political aspects and just that which are part of this war? Every war as political object, because the mere existence of war, if you think about it, it comes only because the failure, the realistic view that the Charter's UN will not be something that will always be upheld. The war will keep on going and keep on erupting, and they will still be a method to achieve some political goals. I'm not the first one. I'm not the first one to identify this tension. There's a very good article by Dr. Rotem Giladi saying that saying that wars are fought for political ends. Conduct must serve the political ends of war. Political ends then control the choice of military means and govern the conduct of belligerent in bello. Even the inherent uncertainty of war and other factors drive antagonists towards I got the idea. Wait. Here it is. Even the inherent uncertainty of war and other factors drive the antagonist towards escalation. So the new wars, the complexity of the notion of victory actually push this question to an extreme. The use of force serves as growing complex for diplomatic aims. If legally only concrete and direct military advantages are to be considered legally applicable in IHL, and for example, taking the targeting from targeting law, how can we bridge the requirements of law and general political aims of war? And how can IHL be relevant? This is not just shot in the air. This is a really big question. Giladi, for example, that identifies this tension, says there is an analytical flow in the frame of IHL. His conclusion is that there's no option other than taking use ad bellum consideration in bello, although the prices, it may have its prices. I have some different maybe solution to this tension, and this is where I start. So my research question was what is the impact of political motives on the legality of action in current warfare under international humanitarian law? And basically, this question brings me to consider the question, the place, the role of military necessity in international humanitarian law, because military necessity is the legal concept that captures the party's interest. It will protect it by law. If military force is implemented to achieve political reasons, or if it's okay by law, it should be in it, or if it's not, it will be in, and then he has to live with other complexities that arise. So the current role of military necessity and its content, its legal requirements, should face the way IHL approaches this tension, this analytical flow, let's say. So actually, I had to meet with a threefold question. First one is, what is the contemporary role of military necessity in IHL? Is it still, maybe, if ever, a preliminary requirement for every military action? It's a very big question. Today, what constitutes military necessity in IHL? And can, taking into account other considerations, undermine the legality of the decision? Okay, so if, for say, the questions are interlinked. If, for say, general political considerations are part of military necessity, they are not. Then, if theoretically they have been, there's no question of other motives because it's already part of the equation. If not, only then the question arises what you do with them once they are not part of the equation. So, military necessity is a very big issue. Now, I'll wait a second before I have to say a few words. surprisingly at first view, and despite the centrality of the concept of military necessity in IHL, often presented as the principle of military necessity, despite the frequent appearance of this concept in IHL conventions, and despite the vast literature exploring it, there are deep gaps in its understanding, and major controversies rage upon its current role in IHL. Some commentators refer to this concept as elusive. Some say, some say that its scope has long been uncertain, in this case, and still others claim that its potential has never been fulfilled. Professor Schmidt writes that no principle is more central in international humanitarian law, no more misunderstood than the principle of military necessity. It is furthermore prima facie very surprising that no modern IHL convention has defined this principle, although it's so frequently referred to in the conventions. Okay, one effort to define it for a specific convention, I'll refer later, if it didn't failed. It's a great test case for me. And we still refer to definition to military necessity, which come from the 1860s and to the hostage case, the Nuremberg case. These are only definitions that we have, both all either flawed or with just do not fit our current understanding of IHL in some aspects. I'll refer to that later. And military necessity is always the bad guy in literature. Also, the famous historian Stefan Neff calls it refers to it the judicial beast of military necessity. Now, I have a different idea about military necessity, because even my idea is that even a beast in story has an important role in the story. So I'll just try to. You have to tell me when to put the. I'll call to the help of the Mission Impossible for that. It's okay.
We have this little problem. Every search for a hero must begin with something that every hero requires: a villain. Therefore, in a search for our hero, Bellerophon, we created a monster, Chimera.
So, the monster, the beast here, Chimera, is obviously the military necessity, and you wouldn't hear me saying that it's not one. Okay, military necessity has definitely played a very, very problematic role in the history of IHL. I'll refer to that, and this is one of the big issues that were confronted during time. But even but the hero, of course, it kind of in the IHL framework, the hero is the humanity, the humanitarian considerations that go into and my idea, they are interlinked, and I will just explain why. Of course, all IHL persons know that. The first thing that all textbooks will say, IHL represents, it's Schmidt saying here, but not only him, saying IHL represents a carefully and thought out of balance between the principle of military necessity and humanity. But in IHL, there is a paradox. The paradox, which identified by Hilaire Macabry, calls it the paradox of humanitarianism. The paradox of humanitarianism goes to refers to the basic question of how IHL can work. How is it impossible to inject humanitarian restraints to war if war itself is a descent to an extra-legal violence? So Macabry tries to face this question of why states or parties to an armed conflict would accept the limitations the humanitarian limitations that IHL presents. And there are different explanations for that, okay? Basically, and I don't have the time to get into them, but it goes to question of reciprocity, moral considerations, and there are even new arguments, for example, Amichai Cohen and Benvenisti argument that war is a government. If there's an article saying that governments practice IHL because it's good, it has internal, because of internal considerations and domestic considerations. There are many explanations trying to bring that why should a law be obeyed, and all of them, again, I don't have the time for it, all of them do not give sufficient or full explanation for this phenomenon. I claim there is another paradox in IHL, which I refer to as the paradox of necessity, which will work as a complementary paradox to the paradox of humanitarianism, and helps, although not it's not the only solution, but helps the further injection of humanitarian considerations, humanitarian limits into IHL. What does this paradox say? Well, generally, it's agreed that during the 150 years more that we are IHL as modern IHL has been developing, that the IHL has been going a process of humanization. This is what Neuron would call it. There's a decline in the place of military necessity in IHL in favor of more humanitarian considerations. This was enabled through a process of concretization of the general norms, injecting more and balanced norms and more into specific conduct. Law has become more detailed. The norms that evolve give a big, inside the norm, you'll find a more balanced, solutions to this necessity versus humanity considerations. But there is a process in this. There is a paradox in this process, and this is the paradox of necessity. During that time, and because of this process, military necessity that once dominated IHL, both as a permissive concept and allowing military action in its sake, and a restrictive one, forbidding actions that do not serve it, has changed itself and stopped functioning as a restrictive principle that overriding all actions in the battlefield. In fact, the process of consideration gave a better balanced legal norm, but with the price that the military necessity losing its overall supremacy. And this also had an enabling function. Thanks to it, IHL leaves through enough margin to states or parties to consider they are achieving their goals today, and their political goals, with respect to IHL restricting demands, and thus enabling the continuation of developing IHL. I'll further explain this paradox. In other words, while taming the principle of necessity in favor of these humanitarian considerations, on the one hand, you had more better norms, and the other one, we had enabled consideration of political motives and other motives exceeding military necessity on the other. This idea is that the necessity has a temporal dimension which was overlooked, as far as I know, in the literature. The temporal dimension is regards also both to the role of the principle of necessity as and the change, the principle itself has changed, both in its content, in internal content, and the criteria relevant to it. And this is something which I have to say is not, it's not the, not appears as such in, it's new, okay? So I just give you, there's a new book, a very good book by Olin and Larry May on the principle on military necessity in international law. And they say that based on the particular codification of principle necessity that one hears most often and that has been adopted by the ICRC, it is clear that the principle has largely remained unchanged since Lieber. Rather, it's the provision, as I said, that changed over the years. The big, this is a big things to say. I hope I'll try to explain why. Okay, so the next thing I'll go with you with the way I was thinking about it and trying to explain what happened. First thing I did is do use analytical, some kind of analytical analysis. The idea is that this is Robert Sloan saying that we must take care not to equate distinct legal concepts merely because they share the same name. It was said in relations to general international law, and it's a very good issue here. Because military necessity, the first thing is to do is just look around and put everything in the right place. There are 5 layers or relevant layers in which we should consider necessity, and until we get to the 4 before one that goes in IHL itself. First of all, there is necessity in general international law, and this in general international law, necessity will serve as the ILC put it, as a secondary norm, a primary norm. It's not actually out here. It's the primary norm will be the substantive one. And the secondary norm will, as a secondary norm, it will say when you can derogate from that substantive norm. So this is IHL, the ILC has notice on that and specifically refer that the necessity in IHL is different. It's playing a different role than in general international law. Another issue in which you consider necessity, it's an idea that came in an article by Hill Colson in the Israeli Law Report, by the way, Barbara, that's saying that necessity is the raison d'etre of IHL, and it goes to the lex specialis idea. Her idea in that case was that we only will refer to IHL as a legal framework where it is necessary to deviate from human rights law. It can be contended. I put it, it's another issue of necessity that can be discussed. Of course, there is necessity in jus ad bellum, and we discussed this in this workshop. Again, to be differentiate different necessity than jus in bello necessity. I feel free just to go on that because we had a discussion and presentation that related to that, so I'll be very brief on that. Then there is necessity in criminal law and international criminal law, because I put them here together because basically the notions are the same. Here in criminal law, necessity, the idea of necessity is again a more derogation from the primary norm, and is also different than IHL, because in IHL, and this is the main issue to take out of all this, necessity serves as one of the factors that constitute the primary norm. As I said, it is the primary, the norms in IHL, it's not derogation out of it, the norms are created as a balance between military necessity and humanitarian consideration. This is why, for example, you cannot deviate from a norm just because military necessity, unless the law, the norm allows you to do that, because it already was taken into account when the norm was created. Okay, this also has reflection in international criminal law in ILC, because it goes into the Rome Statute. It goes to, you can see it also in the trials, the Nuremberg trials, the deviation of an officer due to military necessity from a norm is something which is very problematic. So this is also an issue. So all this to say that military necessity in IHL is a different sphere, and here there are two different ways to look at two complementary layers that you can that we have to look at. First is the general role of military necessity in IHL. I'll explain a bit more about it, and then the content and the criteria. Okay, the general role would say what is how, for example, what is necessity? How will a necessity? How much effect will necessity have on the norms? Or what is the place for military necessity in IHL, and the content and criteria would say what is the internal demands, internal way we understand, legally understand necessity in IHL. So I went and searched the literature and found some analytical analysis that was presented. One, again, McCarver in different, in an article in this case, suggested that we should differentiate between conceiving military necessity by nature as the extra legal dimension to law. When you have turned to military necessity, you're outside the law, or just something within the law. And that goes with the nature of military necessity. Then there is the more frequent use differentiation that is between the permissive aspects of the necessity and the limiting aspects of necessity. This is the most popular way of looking at necessities, the permissive aspects or the self-limiting. Actually, it's not much of a help, I would say, from the beginning, because it's the same size of the same coin. There are other, for example, more like it, excuse me. There are, for example, all in May suggesting that there's other feature as restraint, or basically the same restrictive and permissive side of military necessity. Another contribution is made by Hayashi, who is trying to go through the context of the military of necessity. There's the material necessity, which is the raw and military need. There's the normative necessity, that what is taken from that military understanding into the normative framework, and then the judicial military necessity, which goes to the cases in which the norm could not cover all the issues, and then enables derogation due to that. It actually goes with the process that the norm is, the process of the creation of the norm. I hope I did justice to more than 100 pages of article on that. I'm sure I did not was not enough accurate in this presentation, but the problem is all these tools go with the place and role of the military necessity. They do not teach us about what is the content of the norm itself, okay? So, and then there's nothing. So what I did, okay, this is the analytical step I took here, is, okay, let's go, although I understand the tests, the criteria that are relevant in general international law and criminal law, for example, are not relevant here because different role necessity plays. Let's take them mutatis mutandis and look at the features that we want of military necessity in IHL. Like, we will translate them to some tools that we will be able to follow in our research. First thing is, what would be the protected interests? Okay, in criminal law and international law, there are protected interests that law recognizes as such. Okay, it will not protect some necessities or interests. It will only take those interests that are relevant. So in this case, in our case, it's more like the war aims and the professional military necessity that we are talking about. The other is the dispensability of action. And here we go, there's a range between the last resort that is relevant in criminal law and other cases, and like advantage, just an advantage, useful, to being a useful advantage of doing it. What would be military necessity? Okay, these are all tests, and we'll have to see what the law, we'll try to implement them. And then I thought that looking at the level of concreteness of the law, it can give us some understanding of the quality of the balance between the conflicting interests. Okay, some of the tests we have in criminal law, in international law, go to the balancing between the interest that we are protecting because of necessity, and the interest that can be hurt because of our actions. Okay, like sovereignty, like what is the balance? What would be the balance in each case? Concreteness is just an overview. It can't give us understanding, but a full understanding to it, but it can give us a clue. And it also can, and looking at that specific issue, I was looking at how much open norms that we have in every case. Open norms meaning that in a way that you can deviate from the primary norms because of just military necessity. The more norms that you have that you can deviate, the less protection that the law will give. Okay, the more dominant will be military necessity actually. Okay, Schwarzenegger even said that these rules, he called them purely admonitory because they are these types of rules are just they are so easily it's illusory protection at the end of it because you can always escape from them by military necessity. And at the end of it, I'm trying to check on the overall dominance of the rule. But most importantly, is the overarching goal of necessity. Will it cover all actions in the battlefield? Okay, was I clear on that? Okay, I just again, for shortening things up, I try to write myself the tests I will make to understand what is the place of military necessity and what is the content of military necessity. Okay, and so step 2 was implementing these tests of these tools, both the tools that already have been suggested in writing and the ones that I suggested into the content. So here I try to cover the development in IHL into three stages. The first, the early period, was basically until the Hague, and then we have military necessity definition, personal definition in the Lieber Code. As you can see, it's easily shown that the Lieber Code used the word indispensable, an action, and the other side, the ends of war. The ends of war, what is something that you can consider, which is much larger than the military, technical or professional military considerations. Also, when you go to the Lieber Code, it was the first try to, the first real attempt to cover IHL, to cover protection in detail. So the concrete level of concreteness is relatively low at that time, of course, of the law. But as you can see, military necessity is an overarching principle, and learning that we may try to say that it still has this overarching power. Go and refer to these early writings. There is, of course, the St. Petersburg Declaration, which allegedly has a definition to military necessity. I don't think it's actually a military definition for military necessity, but I'll show you why. But it said that the only legitimate object of state should be endeavored to accomplish during war is to weaken the forces of the enemy, and it's sometimes overlooked that for this purpose it is sufficient to disable the greatest possible number of men. Now, two things about this. First, it is a clearly demonstration of the Clausewitzian way of thinking of mid-19th century, okay? The way to achieve the political goals is to eliminate the fighting forces of the enemy. And as it says, the greatest possible number of men that you have, okay? Military thought today is somewhere very different to them. We're not looking at that, and everybody forgets this sentence when referring to the St. Petersburg Declaration. Remember that the first one and the other one, oh, there's nothing like that, we don't remember. How do I understand that St. Petersburg Declaration still was military necessity, was still relevant to achievement of all aims of war? Simply because there was a Russian draft. In the Russian draft, there was a definition, a proposed definition to military necessity, and it goes by to get the object of war as in it. The total understanding, there's no question that the understanding of that time was that necessity covers the ends of war, okay? There was not much significance to that, and I'll refer to it back in the when I go to the Hague, because it was still the Clausewitzian paradigm that was in the mind of people. The way war is a political issue, there's no question about that. But the way to achieve this political issue is to fight, is to take down the resistance that is brought by the army, and then you can compel the other sides and achieve your political goals. You'll get whatever you want if you take the resistance on the other side. Of course, military necessity in this case, there's a bad turn here with the German guys here, with the principle of Kriegerson. I think I'd apologize in advance. I would never say that word. The principle of Kriegerson get vor Kriegmeier. Okay, so under which that is developed in German doctrine, it is possible to deviate from every legal norm because of military necessity. Okay, this was a very big problem that
the famous phrase, Not kennt kein Gebot. Necessity does not know any rule.
Exactly. So this would only die at the hostage cage in Nuremberg, but it was a very problematic issue. Okay. One more thing I want to say about the St. Petersburg Declaration, mostly so much referred to, that the most important part of the St. Petersburg Declaration is the preamble. The other parts are not. And actually, there's a good critical legal studies writing about it, saying the 400 grams issue was something which is not important at all for the countries, and there was only it only was relevant under this declaration to specific places where the 400 grams would have no real importance. Okay, CLS writing is criticizing that actually there's not much in the protection, the actual protection of IHL. It's all countries taking care of themselves, and with little help, little regulation that really limited their powers. We come to the second stage that I'll refer to it. First is the Hague regulations. Okay, Hague regulations were excuse me, I'll go back for a second. So when we cover it, follow me, Ido here. When you try to implement our tools, previous tools, so I hate those. This is big generalization here, so don't take me on it too much. But the first, the beginning of IHL history, necessity was more than an extra legal dimension and just slowly coming into the norm. Both the permissive and self-limiting sides worked here. Maybe the more permissive or very, very strong one. And I will not speak about Yassis, but not too much judicial derogation here because the context was very, very permissive. The protected interest would be warm aims. The indispensability was a very, very big issue. There's a low level of concreteness at that time, and dominance of necessity was very strong, too strong at that point. Okay, this all, I apologize, a generalization of big process. I'm only referring to the important parts here. So just to carry on my idea. Hague regulations, okay, of course, there are a major step in the process of concretization, okay, still are something we refer to. But again, from now on, we'll not see a definition to military necessity in convention. Military necessity has become an exceptional derogation. It will become in the norm. There's a change of way of thinking from, if you refer to Lieber, it's become a derogation from the norm. You have the norm, and then the necessity of war that you can derogate because of. But what happens when you start being more concrete is that you deal with military necessity in the context of the norm. For example, if you have to say, if the norm deals with war prisoners, and the norm would say that you can visit them, then unless military necessities will allow it, which is actually a norm in the Hague. So we are thinking about military necessity in a very contextual, in a very relevant, and it actually at this point, although the idea that war aims were still were overarching, the war aim necessity was still getting at war aims, norm application of it was a very, very military one. Okay, it became to a more a professional application of that. Another thing is that there was growing blurring between necessity and useful. Both what was left outside the law, but I'll shortly say about when dealing with the when you had military necessities of war, and then you have absolute necessity and imperative necessity. Okay, so this is this caused some confusion, and because as Dinstein would write, everything necessity is necessity. It shouldn't be any other, and we don't have to refer to this absolute, imperative, unavoidable, etc. Wordings. I think not. I think these are very important. I think it both for several reasons, like how you interpret conventions, the principle of maximum effectiveness. Is there a wording in the you have to give? It's not void. You have to give some explanation to the fact that it's written. There's a Latin principle of ut res magis valet quam peret. It's don't let things without without meaning, being void. And we see also, for example, in the Katanga case, the ICC giving to saying, okay, it's not only necessities, it is imperative necessity in that case. So, but the best example I will give will come later on in the 1954 Convention of Cultural Property, and then the second protocol I referred to in the third era. But actually, we see it. I'll already say that. We see that this convention is deliberately giving different levels of protection for different kinds of cultural property. Okay, there's a general culture for general protection to a general cultural property, enjoying the general protection, which is the imperative military necessity, and there is a specific. And there is that to be unavoidable military necessity. Okay, you can see in the in the convention that they actually meant to be something more restrictive. So this carries importance. What I'm saying it's no longer really indispensable. I'm saying that there are different kinds of necessity beginning to show up in IHL. So we don't see anymore the indispensable precondition, and one thing that is often referred to as very important as very important in the Hague is of course the mountains clause, that I think all IHL people know it. It says that actually when there's no answer in law, will go to the principles of international law that result in the usage, establishing a civilized nation from the laws of humanity and requirements of public conscience. So the best thing I have to say about Mountain Clause, first of all, again, it was a product of a political compromise because the sides were not able to agree about the status in this case of the Franco-Tiers, the status of combatants, a reflection to our days. And the other thing, I will quote on that Kotkaniemi, saying that modern international law is an elaborate framework for deferring substance to resolutions elsewhere into further procedure, interpretation, equity, context, and so on. This is exactly, we can't make a decision, okay, we'll refer to some procedure, integrity, some equity issues, go over there. Now, of course, and this is where CLS writing is very critical about Mountain Clause. I think there's a time dimension, and today the Mountain Clause plays a more important role in IHL, but again, we see both the political nature of IHL creation. We see the political nature of IHL creation inside of it. So, Nuremberg trials again rejected the Kriegerson doctrine and brought us the newest definition that we know about military necessity. Now, this definition, I said before, I think in another case, if I'm a legal advisor that wrote it, I can either be promoted or fired. And it depends who I'm representing. Okay, it's absolutely a blur. Okay, again, it's the most problematic of it is the issue of time, life, and money. As Lubin says, for a buck you can you can explain a military necessity by saving $1 in this case. And more importantly, what is the relationship between time, life, and money? That all interests are the same. If I have to save money, is it enough? There's to constitute military necessity that will result in the lives of others. It's a very, although it's praised, it's again, Professor Dinston wrote in the encyclopedia, Max Planck encyclopedia, that's it has been very authoritatively defined in this case. I'm afraid that this definition is very problematic. It calls for the complete submission of the enemy. Again, we talked about it. It's not even the Lieber Code was better on that. The war ends could be other than this. And there are other interests that are not just time, life, and money. For example, when a country is fighting war, the question of reserves of how much bombs are left, or precise munitions are left in those stockpiles that you cannot. It's not a question of money. You can't regain it during the war. It's also a very important issue to consider. That's for one example for this one. So looking at this time, oh wait, what happened here? So okay. So again, military necessity is going its way into law. Both permissive and self-limiting functions are there, but we're going to the limiting issues. And protected interest in context of norms are military considerations at this time, but again, it's much more because of the Clausewitzian context. I can refer to books written at that time, but still military necessity was perceived as something that goes with the war, with the war aims. We see different level of dispensability of action, increasing level of completeness. I already spoke. There's a loss of the overarching role of military necessity. I think already on this time. Modern time, we saw the emergence of the jus ad bellum, which is very critically important for our discussion here. And we go to modern IHL. We see that there's no definition, as I said, to military necessity. Not that one was not needed, okay? On the second protocol for the 1954 cultural property, the discussion before it is a very important issue in that case. The president of UNESCO even suggested a definition for military necessity to be added into to this protocol, and this has failed. The protocol referred to already at that time ideas of notions of military advantage and etc., but did not give it took from the the API definition of targeting and put them and implemented them actually in context of cultural property with extra procedures needed but no definition at the end of this process, although it was identified as a major issue for as to cultural property. Of course, there's no much, I think, controversy that the level of concreteness has risen dramatically. We see it much less open clauses that are left. The norms that we have today are much more give a more delicate balance to the interest of necessity and humanity in them. There's a boost in the humanization, I said, the more humanitarian norms. Again, different level of necessity. In this case, we also see that we won't talk about it too much, but we leave military necessity and now refer to military advantage when we attack targets. Okay, we not trying to see why it's necessary to attack this target. Okay, we just want to see it gives us a definite military advantage. Okay, which is a question of usefulness, not of necessity at the end of it. So, of course, and that is very clear, in military necessity and military advantage as today considered as professional, are referring to military professional considerations. It could be even a bit strategic. You can see the whole operation, there's discussion on that, but it will go to military consideration. Political consideration are outside. So bear with me with this. So what I'm saying in this 3D way of trying to explain things, okay. Again, military necessity has started its way in Lieber Code as an overarching principle. During time, dominance has gradually increased. There is total increase in concretization, but the limiting content of and limiting the content of the protected interest. Okay, the norm is more specific, but it refers only to military considerations. But because the overall dominance, there's no overarching necessity that rules all actions. This was neglected on the way, and the dominance is on the decrease. There's a growing place for other considerations to be taken. This is actually the paradox of necessity, in my view. And I'll briefly refer to, okay, so that's it. What I'm saying, no, that's the idea. Now, the idea is that, again, when you act, the paradox of necessity, you will say that when you act according to IHL, you take the military considerations, but there's no reason for you not to take other considerations in mind, unless those considerations are specifically or generally forbidden by law. Like, for example, terrorizing the population. If that's your motive, oh no, that's your very, very bad lane here, and it's contra law. But you can take into account political motives as long as you your in-law, your military consideration, and you can explain it, and you do and act according to IHL. This is how I resolve the tension, or the analytical flow that Giladi has shown. So another chapter that I said, okay, now let's go out of law and go to military thought and see what happens. And this is also important. I'll briefly mention that. There's a lot to say about. There's a whole chapter thing dealing with this. But both military thought and IHL have come from the same Clausewitzian ideas of the 19th century. The birth of the IHL coincides with the ideas of the Clausewitzian thought. They were there until after Hague in the First World War was actually conceived by military theoreticians as the failure of the Clausewitzian paradigm, and the search, and there began search for other ways of winning the war. But what happened over the years is that IHL military thought have just taken different aspects, different notions from the Clausewitzian paradigm and embraced them or rejected it. Okay, the IHL totally rejected the nature of war, while military thought is dealing more and more with the political nature. The means and ends is more and more relevant in military theory. And IHL is just saying, for the reason I said, keep me away from that as much as possible. IHL focused on force destruction and still tries to focus on force destruction. And military thought is moving away. There's no real dominant military thought today as it was the Clausewitzian. They're searching for a way. From the end of the Second World War, military thought has come closer to Clausewitz, away from Clausewitz. They're still searching the way. It doesn't seem that they're going to find it in the near future, but there are different ideas coming, different doctrines, different ways of winning, and IHL should accommodate them, because IHL should not, to a limit, IHL should not dictate what the military thought that should be relevant. IHL should protect the humanitarian considerations that IHL was. This is IHL aim. But on the other hand, they are going. Although they drifted apart, in a very basically, military thought and IHL are coming closer and closer in two ways. First of all, in a way, IHL goes infiltrate military thought because, as we said, lawfare, for example, or winning the hearts and minds of people will take into account compliance with law. Okay, so from the one hand, military thought is searching for other ways, and the other hand, we have to see that IHL is still relevant in order to win the war. Okay, they are getting closer. Compliance with law is a very important issue, and still, the states, although they are still the subject that still in asymmetrical wars and hybrid wars and etc. and transnational wars are still the main actor that still complies with IHL norms. So military thought and IHL are close in this way. So what I'm saying basically is that the paradox of necessity keeps these two words that are drifting apart in terms of ideas to still together by allowing more leverage for political issues to be considered outside of the equation. Okay, the political issues are not part of the equation in IHL. So I'll bring you back to the Swiss cheese. Again, Swiss cheese is known both for its holes and for its aroma. You love Swiss. What makes Swiss cheese is both of these components. And although CLS writing is very very much critical as it's called, as to it helps us. Law has become, it's a process, and it's a process of political aspects. It's always the rule of law is, as Kotkaniemi or the right is, always a balance between normativity and concreteness, and sovereignty and individualism. It has to balance all these issues, and this is what creates law. This is why law still has holes in it, because it enabling, by leaving enough holes in it, it enables other norms to be injected. I do not agree with some of CLS writing too critical, that saying that actually IHL is that gives no protection. There's no major, and they are right that it's in many cases that there's a reason, there's a safe grounds to say that law did not develop because of the interest of the states in that. But gradually, we do see a shift into more humanitarian law, into better norms, and this is something that we see over time. So my answers for the three questions are this. First of all, military necessity is no longer a parliamentary requirement for every military action under Lex Late. My work deals with Lex Late. I didn't say that before, but it's not too late to say that. I'm not saying that the referenda. I'm not saying that the current situation is best. I'm just trying to understand what law is today, and more importantly, how the check and balances in law today. What is the check and balances in law today, and how they help us maintain this IHL framework in the current warfare. Military necessity is again not political. It doesn't cover. It's not part of military of the norm, and there's a lot of writing on that. And of course, that's not saying otherwise, but you can take into account other motives as long as they're not coincide with another with a notion, with a specific norm or generally forbidden motive by law. Now, is it all bad? As I said, I think it's a complementary paradox to the paradox of humanitarianism, because countries or states still can win. Okay, that's otherwise, if we set aside the political considerations, and it's not part of the, we're not allowing states to consider that, also the incentive to obey the law would also diminish. It has an enabling role. It makes law, it enables, because countries or states are not in some issues do not can still win the war in their eyes. They can more injection to the injection of IHL norms or humanitarian norm can still continue. As I said, it solves the Clausewitzian puzzle that I showed, and enables the separation between jus ad bellum and in bello as possible, and it gives room for modern warfare to applicability to modern military thoughts, which are not only Clausewitzian way of thinking. I'll turn it to targeting, how it would come to the effect. Again, political considerations are not part of the legal equation, but you can still, by choice of targets, promote these considerations. Now, there's a good issue. I will not go too much into it, whether the political, if the military aim, other military aims, should they be the superior or the main cause for your action, or can be just a secondary to the choice. I believe, and I don't have the time to show it because I see it, you're getting hungry, that there's no need for the political idea notion to be secondary. And again, there's applicability of current doctrines in some kind of EBO doctrine, effect-based operations. In some respect, law can accommodate with this, not with all notions, but in some. And of course, the terror bombing, for example, is something which is is something that cannot be done under IHL. Looking ahead, there's a risk, there are prices. There's only, as I said, the paradox plays an important role, but also has its prices. It's at the end of it, we don't have in military necessity in the way that an overarching principle that will give us less humanitarian protection. I didn't get into it, but the examples that are given by the proponents of the capture or kill debate are good examples for that. I have a whole chapter discussing it. The main problem is the question of the slippery slope, the abuse by states or actors of that leverage that they have, making the pursuit for other motives the main reason for and just the IHL reason will be just an excuse. I think there is this can be addressed by referring to a general principle of international law, mainly the principle of good faith and the question of abuse of rights. When you abuse your rights, when you don't act in good faith, and then you have that it gives you're not you're in breach of your rights or obligations, and of course it goes also this that as it is a process, it's not the end point. Things will change, and this paradox is the same as it arise. It can also disappear, and by my idea is that if states will use or abuse this right, it will also be a catalyst for this change. So that's another issue to be considered. So at the end of it, what does the paradox of IHL teaches us? Basically, I believe it reaffirms that IHL is no different from any other legal realm. As in all legal realms, law sets a minimum threshold, giving room to policy considerations and some freedom of action. In every legal realm, there's a constant tension between under-regulation and over-regulation. This is also the case of IHL. Moreover, it seems that over-regulation is a very relative concept. Highly detailed regulation, such as in the area of banking, insurance, simply does not fit IHL. In the realm of regulation of war, where the mere setup of a regulative threshold is regarded as paradoxical, where the law aims are just a priori limited just to elevating the suffering of war, and there is always a danger of aiming too high, some tolerance is necessary. In this sense, law sets a minimum public order, but in a much different and realistic way than the McDonald and Feliciano consider it for the philosopher, the IHL, the international theoreticians among you. So, because what is common to law and war is that they are both political by nature. Both war is politics and law is politics. We cannot extract politics from war without undermining the humanitarian achievement of IHL. Being also political by nature, law accommodates, promoting humanitarian regulation while keeping enough holes in the web where politics can rule. gradually the left stick, and sometimes progress comes with a price, but it is a price that paid that enables IHL to develop. So the question is not if politics, if you allow politics in law, is what kind of politics you want to see in law. This is Gal Barzilai, dean of this faculty, a former dean of this faculty. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm open to questions.
Wow. Definitely wow.
No.
That's a really, really good way for last keynote presentation this lecture.
Thank you.
Nice. Opening for questions and comments. First of all, Manu was where she had to leave at the end.
I understand why she had to leave.
Towards the end, we were like 5 minutes ago.
Okay.
And her words were, now we quote, because it's worth it. Great presentation. Wow. That was quoting her.
Thank you. Thanks, man.
Okay. So, questions, comments, ideas, everything okay there?
I'm sorry, guys. I know you're hungry.
Okay. Stefan, Ricardo, Rajesh. Let's go one by one. Right?
Well, when listening to you, I was wondering, let's say, you made it clear at the end that, let's say, the law must leave room for politics, and if we are talking of kind of armed conflict, it must leave room for use of force, and thus, in a way, for military necessity. It does it differently than the place of necessity was some 150 years ago. I completely agree with that. But the law still leaves room for that. And, let's say my intuition would be that, for example, I was talking on military advantage. Military advantage, I would say, is a placeholder for military necessity, because the law accepts that a belligerent has a legitimate need of using armed force, and gives offers an entry point for that in the legal construction, and this entry point is military advantage. I'm not so sure that it's kind of shifted to the useful. I think as a belligerent, as an armed force, you must still question: do I really need to do that? Mm-hmm. Well, I was talking on collateral damages. Is that really necessary? In the sense, is it justified to incur the kind of the side costs? And this is, I would still say, this is some argument of necessity. It's more than usefulness. But this is, I would say, it's simply an open reflection. I'm not sure about that, because I was kind of ad hoc thinking when listening to you, because that was an interesting kind of attempt at reconceptualizing the basic structure, and sort of, since I've never seen it from that angle, it's very ad hoc.
Okay. Well, I ask you though, because I'm happy to be in a young researchers workshop, because the mere possibility of being here with young people, and my memories will not be so good to.
Well, I'm also not a young researcher.
Okay, so one by one. I think we are saying much of the same. Yes, I say the concreteness of norm here is much better than it was. I have a whole slide about it, and the need for precautions to be taken, and proportionality gives some, of course, the military advantage plays into something like more necessity type. But we are not looking again, not on the ends of war. We're looking at something which is direct.
Yeah.
We are not looking for. We're just looking to
No,
gain.
I agree
to
with
gain
that.
ground. You know, not,
I agree with that kind of professionalization hypothesis that we're not looking to political ends anymore.
Yeah, so
but it's
more useful. What we look at military advantage is something useful in the tactical or in a strategical way. It doesn't have to go like I have to take the target. Okay, I will not be able. I'm telling you as a practitioner to tell you that I have to hit this target. Maybe the army is wrong; it should attack from the other side and not from here. But there is no real solution, especially in the fog of war. You can't know which was the best way. So law says, okay, this is just this looks like give you a military advantage. Ex ante. If you do with the proportionality and proportional analysis, you can do that. Okay, it's not like the Lieber conception that it has to be this indispensable. It's more goes in my way, I think to be more useful on the battlefield. It's not aiming that high. Lieber was problematic. It was both aiming too high and too low. Okay, the action has to be indispensable. It's impossible to show that, but it could be taken in very.
But I would say that's in a way that's epistemic decency because we know too much that we don't that we know so few,
Exactly.
and that we are not capable of knowing what is really necessary.
Exactly.
So we have to we have to be much moderate on that.
Exactly. Law has also become more realistic, more applicable in in this way. So this is maybe one of the other reasons it abandoned the rhetoric of the 19th century. We have to say, okay, it has to be indispensable, which actually comes if you think about more previously philosophical thinking of even just war theory. The old it's a rhetoric that okay, we have to do that. It's necessary to implement force. But if it justifies, then everything is justified. Almost everything. Almost. Okay.
It's up to me. First question, it's probably out of me not being able to follow you fully at the beginning. When you referred to military necessity in the early stage, there was the St. Petersburg.
Okay.
I didn't get if military necessity was and the laws of the conflict were cumulative or alternative criteria upon which someone would have enacted an operation. I was confused.
You couldn't understand exactly what you.
The lawfulness of an operation
Okay.
was depending either on the laws of the conflict or in the military necessity.
It's mainly on the military necessity at that time. What would come to military necessity? If you could explain, if you acted out of military necessity, it would be fine. Okay, so and the Petersburg Declaration here said also something what I said it on the Clausewitzian way of thinking. Okay, you will point your weapons against the fighting forces of the enemy and take as many as possible of them, and then you get your political the aims of war. I hope I answered you.
No, definitely.
Okay.
Yes. Can we say that military necessity is always contextual?
Yes, exactly. The contextual, what I'm saying there's a temporal, which is a contextual, temporal dimension to military necessity. And in this way, it's contextual. It is also contextual in the norm. It's contextual in many other levels that you are that you can refer. My contextualism here was the time dimension, the shift over time, the change over time of military necessity, the criteria, the content of military necessity has changed. But I'm saying basically when people say refer to the 19th century documents and still refer to it, yeah, not people only, but tribunals still refer to this to these definitions. It's not accurate. It's different today in the way we grasp military necessity. So this is the contextuality of the things.
Next one is Anna. You have a question?
Not a question, just a brief observation. The St. Petersburg Declaration was also said about how the requirements of military necessity ought to yield to requirements of humanity.
Okay.
And although it is accused of, it has been criticized of this circularity about towards the end, talking about how to conciliate those two.
Okay.
But still, we talk about how military necessity would, give in to humanity. And also, even the Lieber Code, which includes some, these infamous provisions, but military necessity, and I think that it is important to highlight those two, when discussing it. Military necessity is also framed in terms of legality, and how military necessity is, just to quote, that it is itself limited by the law. It was about ends which are lawful according to the modern law and uses of war.
Okay.
So I think that it's important in discussing even at this point and in that historical context.
I fully agree with that. There is no question. That's from the beginning. It was left by the military doctrine of Kriegerson and abandoned it. But from Lieber, you could see that military necessity is subject to the laws of war. At that time, there were not too many laws of war that will be subject to it, and it's that gradually grow with the concrete.
In that sense, but still it was about armies and massive
But
armies.
there's no way to understand the St. Petersburg Declaration as the supremacy for humanitarian considerations over military necessity, and I can refer to an article in something that specifically also mentioned that. Of course, that the other thing I want to say, it's also very important to, when looking into conventions, all of the preamble parts are more declarative and less like sometimes very aiming high and saying things that when you look after it into the convention itself, there's not much to it. This is for the St. Petersburg example is very good for that, because the preamble says a lot of very important things, but actually dealt with a very specific issue, a specific and gave legal protection by its preamble. Preamble declaration is something that is very good to have. It's not always you can understand from it what law is. Okay, they are aiming very high, but when you actually look at norm on the protection that is given by this convention, then you have these different. It's a way. What's the right way to look at the preamble? Of course, that during time, also the St. Petersburg Declaration, you get into it here, played a more and more increasing role in importance, and it was repeated in modern some phrases, some words from that preamble, and have been repeated in other more conventions and playing a more and more important role. This is why I'm saying that it goes with what I'm saying about CLS, the analysis or the critical analysis of IHL, and that I sometimes think go differently and much in a better way after a while, after a decade. Although at the beginning there was no real protection given to printers, like the Martin's clause, like the preamble. But the beginning it's a preamble. It speaks in a very high words and gives little protection by itself.
When is that? Yeah. Okay, that leaves me with two, I think, short comments. First of all, since you've submitted your PhD, I have a very interesting question for me, which is, what was the point of origin? Why necessity? What drew you?
I thought I explained it. Listen, okay, it goes for everyone. As you know, I come from a practice, and I've seen not only the Israeli army here, but I've seen others, and I understand that it's always been very give me food for thought. It was a big dilemma how things are, how to consider a larger scale or larger motives inside the framework of IHL. And basically, I was thinking, like at the beginning, I thought much more like legality. Something is very, very flawed here. This is every PhD, I think, begins with something that really puzzles you. And that really bothered me, because I've seen, and that's another thing about, I haven't spoken about it, but I think that the dilemmas, although there's a try to say, okay, which some people try to say, some commentators try to say, okay, IHL is for the operative, for the commander, and there's the more strategic decisions that are made. What I think is that in modern times, it starts in a lower level. The decision, the complexity, the strategic issues are bothering not only the Ministry of Defense, not only the Prime Minister, not only the Ministry of Defense, and not even the Chief of Staff. They are going into lower levels, and not to the contrary. I haven't talked about it, but for example, in the Mike Schmidt and John Miriam article about the terminal context, they examined the Israeli practice in targeting, and they mentioned that in some cases, a specific target will go not only to the military level, but also the political level. So things are very blurring here. The idea that, okay, this is the operational commander, he will do IHL, and he will just consider military consideration, and that's it. And there's the political high level, then there's something that separates them. Well, guys, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's not like that, not anywhere in this case. And decisions are one of the characteristics of modern warfare is that the decisions are made in lower levels, or at least lower levels have to recommend the higher levels what to do, and they have to take into account what the aims of the operation, of the political aims are when they make the decision. The political level will not decide, okay, in order to achieve our political goals, we will strike these targets and make does not go like that, not at all. It starts in a lower level, and the political authorities will decide that the aims of war, and sometimes are very concrete, make concrete decisions. And from this, I had problems both with the practical aspect of it and like the analytical flow with it. And both bothered me. And this is where I came to this in-depth research.
And my second question is, I hope I'm not repeating anyone else's question before, but you referred to the fact that necessity has moved to military advantage, right?
Not only, okay, I'm further, okay, I was generalizing, don't catch me, there is still reference to military necessity, of course, but the appearance of military advantage is
But
something
that's more
that...
on targeting.
What?
That's more on the question of distinction, the
Okay.
military advantage. Whether or not you're allowed to attack something,
Okay.
that's natural location purpose or use. That's
Okay.
military advantage.
Okay,
Necessity is one step prior to that. Whether or
this is
not
what I'm saying. There is no need for necessity. There is no way to speak about necessity. This is why we speak today in modern convention about on targeting issues on military advantage. You cannot. This is, I think, what I answered Professor Uter. There is no, when you in the fog of war, there's nothing that can say it's. You pick up targets that you want to attack. You only think you can't say it because it's necessary to pick them. You're looking for what will give you a military advantage by picking them. There's no a priori need to show military necessity. Once you answer the demands or the what Article 52.2, for example, or if it's combatants, other sources will say it's okay to hit, then you pass this test. You don't have an overarching principle of necessity saying, okay, you have to first say it's necessary. Both from practical issue point of view and both but legal issue, you don't have to.
But wouldn't you say that there is a difference between the soldier or commander on the ground and the
Yes, of
commander
course.
in the headquarters and the cabinet? The question of necessity becomes more and more relevant.
Of course, I'm not
the higher
saying
you go.
I'm not saying otherwise. I'm saying it's of course at the end of it, everything is a main context application. Okay, but the question that I started with is whether, if at all, someone on the chain of here, if not the soldier on the ground, which I agree has no knowledge and cannot implement the political aspiration of his country. It's aiming too high, too far, and it's irrelevant. It's rubbish. But the question was whether someone can take these political issues into account. And my answer is yes, as long as you keep on with IHL, notions of military advantage, also of necessity in a very professional meaning. Also, if you keep them, and then you can take another considerations, more larger consideration into account. This is what I'm saying.
Any more questions, comments? Okay. Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you, guys.